Her cruel husband left her for dead after a snakebite, but a silent Apache found her, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged mountains, casting a warm golden glow over the dry landscape. Sarah had always dreamed of a better life, far away from the bustling town and the suffocating expectations of society. She had hoped that this journey with her husband Thomas would be the fresh start they both needed. But as the days passed, the vast, empty wilderness only seemed to stretch on, endless and unwelcoming. The further they traveled, the more isolated she felt. Thomas, once so full of life and passion, had become distant. His temper had grown unpredictable, and the man she had once fallen in love with now barely acknowledged her presence. Sarah tried to ignore the growing tension between them, focusing on the promise of a new beginning, but it was hard to silence the creeping dread in her chest. That afternoon, as they trekked deeper into the wilderness, Sarah felt the sharp sting of pain in her leg. A snake, camouflaged in the dry underbrush, had struck without warning. Sarah's scream echoed through the air as the venom began to spread rapidly through her bloodstream. She fell to the ground, clutching her leg in agony, her body trembling. "Thomas!" she cried, reaching out to him. "Help me!" Thomas turned slowly, his face impassive. Sarah's heart pounded as she saw the coldness in his eyes, a look that was becoming all too familiar. She gasped for breath, trying to push herself up, but the pain was unbearable. "Help me!" she begged again, her voice weak and desperate. "Please, Thomas. The snake." He stepped back, not in fear, but in indifference. "It's too dangerous to stop," he muttered, his eyes flickering with impatience. "You should have been more careful." Sarah's mind reeled. This wasn't happening. Her heart sank into her chest. She had always known that Thomas could be distant, but never cruel. As the venom spread through her body, making her dizzy and weak, she felt a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than the pain in her leg. "Thomas, please," she whispered, struggling to sit up. But he was already turning away. "I'm not staying here for this. We're too far from the town." Her thoughts blurred as she watched him walk away.
There were no tears left to shed, only a hollow emptiness where love had once thrived.
She couldn't believe it. The man who had promised to stand by her, to protect her, was now abandoning her in her most desperate moment. As Thomas disappeared into the distance, Sarah's vision began to swim, her body growing colder by the second. She wanted to scream, to beg him to come back, but the words wouldn't come. Her breath was shallow, her body weakening with every passing second. With her last ounce of strength, she let her head fall back onto the rough ground, her mind clouded with confusion and hurt. The air around her felt heavy, as if the weight of the desert itself was pressing down on her chest. Sarah's thoughts scattered, but one thing remained clear. Her life had just shattered in that moment. Hours passed in a haze. The hours passed in a haze, the desert's relentless heat making the air feel thick and suffocating. Sarah's body was growing weaker, and her thoughts were growing harder to focus on. The poison from the snakebite had spread too far, and she knew in her heart that it was only a matter of time before she succumbed to it. She could barely keep her eyes open now, the darkness of the approaching night enveloping her. But in the midst of her fading consciousness, she heard a sound, a rustling in the distance. It was faint at first, like the wind stirring the dry leaves, but it grew louder, closer. Sarah's heart fluttered with a glimmer of hope, though she wasn't sure if it was real or just a desperate dream. Footsteps, firm and steady, approached her. She could barely make out the figure that appeared through the haze. It was a man, tall, with a presence that was unmistakable. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the landscape with sharp precision. He seemed out of place, a stranger in a desolate land. But as he knelt beside her, his eyes met hers with a quiet intensity that sent a wave of calm through her rattled nerves. He didn't speak at first. His face was unreadable, but there was no fear or uncertainty in his movements. He didn't hesitate. His hands were steady as he examined the wound on her leg, his touch gentle yet sure. Sarah's mind was barely functioning, but she could feel the urgency in his actions. He knew what he was doing. He worked quickly, cutting away the torn fabric of her dress to expose the bite. She could feel him applying something cool to the wound, a balm that seemed to ease the burning pain for a moment. The man's presence was like a quiet storm in the midst of Sarah's turmoil. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. She wanted to thank him, but her throat was dry, her body too weak to move. He glanced at her, his face solemn. Then, without a word, he picked her up carefully, his arms strong but tender, as he lifted her from the ground. She wanted to protest, to tell him to leave her there, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt her body relax, her limbs giving in to the warmth of his embrace. He moved with quiet determination, carrying her as if she weighed nothing, each step purposeful. The desert, once so vast and intimidating, seemed to recede as the man walked through it with her in his arms. The shadows of the night grew longer, but Sarah felt strangely at peace in his hold. She didn't know who this man was, but in that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of safety. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt like she wasn't alone. Her mind drifted as he walked, and the pain began to ebb, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of comfort. The world around her grew blurry, the sounds of the desert fading as her eyelids grew heavier. Sarah allowed herself to slip into unconsciousness, trusting the man who had found her in the wilderness. And though she was on the brink of death, she felt something stir inside her, a flicker of hope, fragile yet real, that maybe this man, this stranger, would be the one to save her. Sarah's mind slowly began to clear as the unfamiliar scent of earth and sage filled her senses. Her body was cradled in a gentle but firm hold, and for a moment she felt like she was dreaming. The pain in her leg had dulled, and the dizzying haze that had gripped her thoughts was starting to lift. She could hear the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the quiet hum of the wilderness around her. The familiar sting of the venom was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of warmth and safety. When she opened her eyes, everything around her seemed unfamiliar. She was no longer lying on the hard, unforgiving desert floor. Instead, she was resting against something soft, perhaps a blanket or a piece of animal hide, inside a small shelter. A fire crackled in the center of the room, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. The air smelled of smoke, wood, and the earthy scent of nature, a far cry from the dry, hot winds of the desert she had left behind. Sarah blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The walls of the shelter were simple, made of branches and animal skins. The soft light of the fire danced around her, but there was no sign of anyone else. Her heart began to race as she tried to sit up, her head still foggy. But before she could fully lift herself, a figure appeared at the entrance of the shelter. It was the man who had carried her. He stood in the doorway, watching her with quiet intensity. His features were strong, defined by years of living in the harshest conditions. His skin was weathered, but his dark eyes were sharp and full of purpose. His expression was calm, though Sarah could sense that he was cautious, perhaps as much of her as of the world outside. She took a deep breath, still trying to comprehend everything that had happened. The man moved with ease, stepping closer to her without a word. His movements were fluid, controlled, like someone used to the wild, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He was dressed in simple clothes, dark, rugged, and well-worn, but there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of a life much different than her own. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a rasp. She tried to sit up again, this time more carefully, feeling the heat of the fire on her face. The man did not speak, but he nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze never leaving hers. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Sarah tried to piece together the events that had led her here, but the memories were still hazy. She remembered the snakebite, the searing pain that had gripped her, the cold indifference of her husband as he walked away and left her to die. She remembered the feeling of betrayal, the last shred of hope slipping away as she realized he would not come back. But then there was the man, this stranger, who had appeared when she thought there was no one left. His presence had brought her the comfort she so desperately needed, his silence speaking louder than any words could.
"Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly.
The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he bent down beside her, and gently adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. His hands were strong but gentle, his touch surprisingly soft for someone who seemed so capable of surviving the harsh conditions of the wild. Sarah's breath hitched as she met his gaze, wondering how much he had seen in his life to make him so calm, so composed in the face of her fear and weakness. "I'm grateful," she said, her voice faltering. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." The man's lips twitched slightly, but he remained silent. He straightened and moved toward the fire, his attention fixed on the crackling flames. Sarah couldn't help but watch him, intrigued by his calm demeanor. There was something about him that felt so different from Thomas, so different from everything she had known. Where Thomas had been impatient, cold, and indifferent, this man was patient, quiet, and careful. He seemed to be someone who listened to the world around him, who understood it in a way that Sarah could barely grasp. After a moment, he stood up and gestured for her to stay where she was. Sarah nodded, too exhausted to protest, and watched as he moved to the far corner of the shelter. He returned a moment later with a small wooden bowl filled with water. He knelt beside her again, his movements deliberate but smooth, and offered the bowl to her. "Drink," he said, his voice low and rough. It was the first time he had spoken, and Sarah almost didn't recognize the sound of his voice. It was deep, steady, but filled with a quiet strength that reminded her of the wilderness itself. She took the bowl gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The cool water slid down her throat, soothing the dryness that had settled there. As she drank, she noticed how the man remained silent, watching her but never making her feel uncomfortable. He gave her space, yet his presence was reassuring, like a steady anchor in the chaos of her thoughts. When she had finished drinking, she handed the bowl back to him. He took it without a word, his expression still unreadable. There was something calming about the way he moved, as if he had all the time in the world. For the first time since her world had shattered, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. "I don't know how you found me," she said quietly, "but I'm so glad you did." The man gave a small nod, his face softening for just a moment. Sarah couldn't help but notice how his eyes seemed to have a quiet depth to them, as if he had seen things that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. There was a wisdom in him, a peace, that Sarah had never known in her own life. For a long time neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the background, and the night outside seemed to stretch endlessly. The world felt so vast, so empty, and yet in that small shelter Sarah felt a strange comfort. She looked at the man again, her thoughts drifting. The hurt from her past seemed so far away now, like a distant memory she could barely grasp. The venom that had threatened to take her life had been stopped, not by the man's words, but by his actions. He had saved her without asking for anything in return. Sarah let out a long, shaky breath, her chest tight with emotion she didn't fully understand. She had been so desperate, so alone, but now she was here, with this man, safe for the moment. And for the first time in a long time she felt something stirred deep inside her, something that felt like hope. The man's presence was an enigma. He was a stranger, yet in this place, in this wild land, he was the one who had found her and saved her. Sarah didn't know what would happen next, but she was no longer afraid. With him here, she felt like she could survive anything. The days that followed felt like a blur to Sarah. Her body had been battered by the venom, but it was more than that. She was healing, but her mind was still trying to catch up. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her husband Thomas, walking away from her, leaving her behind. His face had been so cold, so unfeeling, and the pain of his abandonment lingered like a sharp, unwanted ache deep in her chest. But every time she woke up, there was the man, the stranger who had saved her. His presence was quiet, but it was always there, grounding her in a way she had never known before. His name, she had learned, was Howick. He had not said much about himself, but she had learned that he was a man of few words. He didn't need to say much. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The way he cared for her, how he made sure she had food and water, how he tended to the fire without a single complaint, showed more of his character than any lengthy conversation could. He didn't try to talk about her past, and he didn't ask questions about hers. It was as if he understood that silence could be just as healing as words. In the mornings, he would silently bring her food, some small game or wild fruits he had gathered from the land. He would place it beside her and leave without saying a word, giving her space to eat. He never rushed her. He always gave her time. She noticed that he was patient, moving through the camp with a quiet, deliberate grace. It was as if the wilderness was a part of him, as much a part of him as his own skin. Every movement was purposeful, filled with a kind of deep understanding of the world around him. Sarah had always been someone who filled the silence with words. Back in her life with Thomas, silence was something that made her uncomfortable, something that made the distance between them feel even wider. But with Howick, silence was never uncomfortable. It wasn't something to fill. It was something to be honored, something to let be. She had never known such peace. Days passed in this quiet routine, and Sarah felt her strength slowly return. Each day she felt the poison from the snake's bite leave her body, and each day she felt a little less weak, a little more like herself. Her body wasn't the only thing healing, though. The emotional wound left by her husband's betrayal was slowly beginning to heal, too. She had been so focused on the pain of that moment, when Thomas had turned his back on her. But in this place, with this man, the rawness of her heart was slowly being soothed. It was a strange, comforting feeling, but she wasn't sure how to understand it. One afternoon, as Sarah sat by the fire, Hawick approached with a bundle of herbs in his hands. He set the herbs down beside her and sat across from her, the crackling of the fire filling the silence between them. "Your leg is better," he said softly, his voice low, like the wind that moved through the trees. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since she had arrived. She glanced up at him, surprised by the simple observation. "I can feel it getting better," Sarah replied, her voice still a little weak, but steadier than before. She shifted her leg slightly, testing the muscles. It no longer hurt as much. The swelling had gone down, and the deep redness had faded into the familiar skin tone. It was a relief to see that the wound was closing, the marks of the venom slowly disappearing. She had feared she would be left with a scar, a constant reminder of the ordeal. But now she could see that there was hope for her full recovery. Howick nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corner of his lips. He didn't speak further, but his gaze lingered on her, and Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. There was something about the way he looked at her, something gentle, something that made her feel like he understood her in a way no one else ever had. It was a quiet understanding, a respect for her pain, her struggle, and the strength she had shown, even when she hadn't believed she had it. After a long pause, Sarah finally spoke, her voice soft but full of curiosity. "Why did you help me?" It had been nagging at her since she woke up in his shelter. He had no reason to help her. She wasn't family. She wasn't someone he knew. She was a stranger in his land, someone who had been left behind by the man who was supposed to protect her. So why had Hawick stopped to help? Why had he taken her in, cared for her, when he could have easily walked away, just like Thomas had? Hawick didn't answer right away. He reached down and picked up a piece of wood, slowly poking the fire with it. The flames danced higher, crackling as they shifted in the wind. He seemed to be contemplating his response, as if he had to choose his words carefully. "I saw you," he said finally, his voice steady. "I saw you in pain. You didn't deserve to die like that. No one deserves that." His words were simple, but they struck Sarah deeply. They were filled with an honesty, a quiet truth that made her heart skip a beat. She had never thought of herself in those terms, someone who deserved to be saved. In her mind, she had always been the one to fight for others, to protect those she loved. But now, in this moment, in this place, someone had fought for her, and that thought filled her with a strange warmth she hadn't expected. "You saved my life," she whispered, still processing what he had said. She looked at him, trying to make sense of the quiet man who had, in his own way, brought her back from the brink. She had been left to die by the man who was supposed to love her, but now she was here, alive, and it was because of him. Howick nodded, his face calm but full of something Sarah couldn't quite place. "Life is not meant to be taken easily," he said simply, "not even by those who believe they are entitled to it." His words hung in the air between them, their weight heavy but comforting. Sarah had never considered that before. She had always seen life as something she had to fight for, something she had to prove her worthiness for. But here, with Hawick, she realized that life itself was a gift that wasn't just to be fought for, but to be respected. As the days wore on, Sarah found herself feeling a connection to the land around her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to understand. She was beginning to feel at peace. The world around her, wild and untamed as it was beginning to feel like home. She could feel herself changing, not just physically, but emotionally too. She no longer felt the weight of her past pressing down on her every waking moment. The pain of her husband's betrayal was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. It was a part of her story, a part of her past, but it no longer defined her. And in a way, it was because of Hawick that she was able to let go. He didn't need to say anything else. The way he moved through the world, the way he cared for her without words, had shown her everything she needed to know. In his quiet way, he had taught her what it meant to truly live, to embrace the silence, to respect life, and to understand that sometimes the most profound connections didn't need to be spoken. Sarah's recovery continued, day by day. The wild terrain around her became less of a foreign place and more of a home. The more she explored the area, the more she learned from Hawick. He was patient with her, showing her the plants and herbs that grew in the hills, how to find water in the dry soil, and how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the animals. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were simple and filled with wisdom. Everything he did seemed purposeful, and with each passing day, Sarah began to understand the world he lived in. It wasn't just about survival. It was about respect for the land, the animals, and the people. It was about living in harmony with the world around you, not fighting against it. Sarah had always thought of life in terms of struggle, of fighting against forces she couldn't control. But here in the wilderness, she was learning to accept things as they were, to observe, to learn, and to live without constantly forcing her will onto everything. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the mountain, Sarah sat by the fire watching the sky slowly turn from deep blue to golden orange. She had started to feel stronger now, her legs no longer trembling when she walked, and the sharp, lingering ache in her body had dulled to a quiet throb. She was almost back to full strength, but the emotional scars from her past still lingered. Every now and then her mind would drift back to the day her husband had abandoned her, and the betrayal still stung. Hawick came over, holding a small bundle of herbs in his hand. He bent down beside her and set them carefully on the ground. "The desert is quiet this morning," he said softly, his deep voice breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, not knowing exactly what to say. She had never been someone who was good at handling silences. She was used to filling every quiet moment with words, but with Hawick, the silence felt comfortable. It was like there was no need to fill the space between them. His presence alone made it feel safe. She glanced up at him. "Why do you live out here?" she asked, her voice curious. "Why not with your people?" Hawick didn't look at her right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. For a long time he didn't speak, and Sarah wondered if he would answer at all. Just when she was about to turn away, he finally spoke. "Some people choose to live in silence," he said quietly. "Not because they have no voice, but because they have nothing left to prove." Sarah thought about his words for a long time. She understood what he meant, though she couldn't put it into words herself. There had been a time in her life when she had felt like she had something to prove, to both Thomas and the world. She had spent so many years trying to make everyone see her worth, trying to prove that she was valuable. But all of that had been stripped away when Thomas had abandoned her. Now, out here in the wilderness, she didn't need to prove anything. She was simply surviving, living in the moment, and learning from everything around her.
"That's what you're doing, isn't it?" Sarah asked softly. "Living in silence because you don't need to prove anything." Hawick turned to her, his gaze steady.
He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes softened, and for a moment Sarah could see a flicker of something in them. Perhaps the same kind of understanding, that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly between them. Sarah felt a deep sense of peace, but she also felt a stir of something more, a feeling that was growing stronger each day. She didn't know what it was, but it was there, a quiet warmth that seemed to blossom whenever she was near him. It wasn't something she had expected to feel, especially after everything she had been through. But it was there, undeniable and real. Later that afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Sarah and Howick set out together, walking through the forest. She still had to be careful, her body not quite at full strength, but she could feel herself getting stronger with each step. She had learned to trust her body again, to feel the strength that was slowly returning. And with Howick beside her, there was a sense of security she had never known before. They came across a stream, its clear water bubbling gently over rocks. The forest around them was lush and green, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Howick knelt down beside the stream, dipping his hands into the water. He cupped his hands and brought the water to his lips, drinking deeply. Sarah watched him, marveling at how effortlessly he seemed to blend into his surroundings. It was as if the world around him had always been his home. She took a deep breath, the coolness of the air filling her lungs. She felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly free. After drinking, Howick stood and looked at her. "There is no true freedom without understanding," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. Sarah nodded slowly, her heart racing as his words sank in. He was right. She had spent so much of her life searching for freedom, freedom from the constraints of society, freedom from the chains of her marriage. But now, she realized, real freedom came from understanding herself, from letting go of the past and embracing the present. It wasn't about escaping anything. It was about being at peace with what was and who she was in that moment. They continued on, walking in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As the sun began to set, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange, Sarah felt a quiet sense of gratitude wash over her. She had been so broken, so lost when she arrived here, but now in the company of this quiet, steady man, she was starting to heal. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. They reached a small clearing where Howick had built a shelter, and as they settled in for the night, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging. The fire crackled softly in the center of the shelter, its warm glow flickering in the dimming light. Sarah glanced over at Howick, who was sitting quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire. She didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to speak. In the silence, she knew she was safe. In this moment, in this place, she was beginning to understand what true peace felt like. The days had become weeks, and Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm that she hadn't thought possible. The mornings were spent with Howick, learning more about the land, about the quiet ways of survival that seemed so effortless to him. He taught her to move silently through the trees, to listen to the whispers of the wind that spoke of coming storms or distant animals. She learned to identify tracks in the soil, signs of creatures that had passed by in the night. The skills he shared with her were more than just survival. They were lessons in respect. Respect for the land, for the creatures that roamed it, and for herself. The ache of her past still lingered, but it was no longer all-consuming. With each passing day, the memories of Thomas became less sharp, less painful. She no longer felt like a victim of his cruelty. Instead, she began to see how much strength she had, how much she had endured and survived. Out here, in the wilderness, she had reclaimed a piece of herself that had been lost for so long. It was early one evening when Sarah found herself sitting by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. She had always loved the fire, the way it seemed to dance and change with every breath of wind. But tonight there was something different about it, something that seemed to mirror the changes in her own heart. The fire crackled, and she was reminded of her journey, how far she had come, from the painful past she had left behind to the quiet peace she had found in this place. Howick sat beside her, as always, his gaze fixed on the fire. They were silent for a long while, neither of them feeling the need to speak. The comfort of the silence was enough. It was a silence that spoke volumes. a silence filled with understanding, with mutual respect, and with the kind of connection that didn't need to be explained. Sarah's thoughts drifted, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a stir of something more than just peace. It was a feeling that had been growing inside her for weeks now, but tonight it felt stronger than ever. As she looked over at Howick, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the fire, she realized something that both surprised and comforted her. She had grown fond of him. More than fond. She cared for him deeply. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just the understanding that he had saved her life. There was something deeper, something that had been quietly building inside her since the first moment she had woken up in his care. He was strong, but in a way that wasn't forceful. He was quiet, but in that quiet, he held a wisdom that spoke to her heart. He respected her, saw her as more than just someone to be pitied or protected. And as Sarah sat there, watching the fire flicker, she realized that she had begun to rely on him not just for survival, but for the feeling of safety and calm he gave her. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she needed so desperately. She didn't know when it had happened, but somehow she had stopped seeing herself as alone. She wasn't alone anymore, not with Howick by her side.
Why did you help me?
Sarah asked suddenly, her voice soft, almost hesitant. It was a question that had been on her mind for a while now, one she hadn't asked before because she hadn't known how to phrase it. But tonight it felt important to ask, important to understand. Howick turned his gaze toward her, his eyes steady and calm. He didn't seem surprised by the question, as if he had been expecting it. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling slowly. And then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I saw you," he said simply. "I saw someone in pain, someone who had been left behind. I couldn't leave you like that." His words were simple, but they hit Sarah like a wave. She had known, deep down, that Howick's decision to help her hadn't been out of obligation. It hadn't been pity. It had been because he had seen something in her that no one else had bothered to see. He had seen her as more than just a victim. He had seen her as someone worth saving. In that moment, Sarah realized something else, that she hadn't just healed physically since that day. She had healed emotionally, too. The anger she had once felt toward Thomas had faded. The bitterness, the feelings of betrayal were still there, but they didn't hold power over her anymore. They were just memories, distant echoes from a past she had left behind. What mattered now was the present, and in the present, there was Howick. The fire crackled between them, the warmth of the flames spreading through Sarah's chest. She felt it then. Something she had never felt with Thomas. Something that was both frightening and beautiful. It was a connection, an undeniable bond that had formed between them over the weeks they had spent together. She cared for him in a way she hadn't expected, and as that realization settled in, she felt a mix of emotions, a deep gratitude for everything he had done for her, but also something more, something that made her heart race and her thoughts scatter. Howick didn't speak again, but his silence was filled with understanding. He didn't need to say anything. His presence, the way he had been with her through every step of her recovery, said everything. He had never asked for anything in return. He had simply been there when she needed him, without expectation or demand. And that made her feel something she hadn't felt in so long. Worthy. The evening wore on, the stars above beginning to shine brightly in the dark sky. The night was cool, but the fire kept them warm, its glow reflecting off the trees that surrounded their small camp. Sarah turned to Howick, her heart pounding with an emotion she had no name for, but which she knew was real. She had never imagined her life turning out this way, away from the life she had known, surrounded by nature and finding something in herself she hadn't known was there. She didn't know what would happen next, what future awaited her, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going back. Not to the life she had before, not to the man who had left her to die. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. It wasn't just for saving her life. It was for showing her that there was more to life than what she had believed. It was for giving her a second chance, not just at survival, but at life. Howick looked at her then, his dark eyes meeting hers with a kind of quiet depth that took her breath away. He didn't need to say anything else. She understood now. Together they sat by the fire, the crackling of the flames the only sound between them. And as Sarah stared into the glowing embers, she felt something new stir in her chest. A quiet, steady hope for the future. She didn't know what was to come, but with Howick by her side, she knew she was ready to face it, whatever it was.